The late afternoon sun bathed the sprawling lot of South Point Motors in a wash of amber and gold. Light glinted off windshields and polished chrome, transforming the dealership into a landscape of shimmering metal. A steady, pleasant hum of activity filled the air, the murmur of conversations, the soft thud of car doors, the distant laughter of a family leaning into a spacious SUV. Customers moved in a leisurely flow between the rows of vehicles. A young couple debated colors by a compact electric car. An older man ran his hand along the truck bed of a pickup, his expression thoughtful. Salespeople in crisp shirts navigated the lot with purposeful energy, clipboards in hand, their voices a chorus of helpful pitches and scheduled follow-ups. At the far perimeter of the lot, away from the main clusters of shoppers, a modest, slate-gray sedan rolled to a quiet stop. The engine cut off, leaving silence. The driver's door opened and Taryn stepped out. He was a tall man with a posture that spoke of quiet assurance. His attire was understated but deliberate, a perfectly fitted white dress shirt, sleeves rolled once at the forearms, dark tailored trousers, and shoes polished to a subdued shine. He looked like a consultant or a professor, someone who dealt in consideration, not pressure. For a long moment he didn't move toward the showroom. He simply stood by his car, his calm, observant eyes performing a slow sweep of his new domain. His gaze was analytical, missing nothing. It tracked the efficiency of a salesperson guiding a client, noted the cleanliness of the walkways, assessed the appealing arrangement of the flagship models at the front. He watched the easy rhythm of commerce, the dance of sale and selection that played out under the warm sun. A small, private smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. He adjusted the simple, elegant watch on his wrist, not because he was late but as a punctuating gesture. A decision made. He closed the car door with a solid, quiet thud and began to walk. His pace was unhurried, almost meditative. He moved past rows of sedans, his reflection gliding, distorted, across their glossy hoods. He observed the dealership not as a customer hungry for a deal, but as a gardener inspecting the health of his plants. He noted a piece of litter near a trash can, the slightly crooked angle of a promotional sign, the genuine enthusiasm of a young salesman explaining a feature. He was a portrait of contained intention. His eyes, sharp and missing nothing, cataloged the details that spoke of the dealership's culture, the visible details and the whispered ones between them. The automatic glass doors of the main showroom whispered open as he approached, and the atmosphere shifted. The warm outside air was replaced by a cool, climate-controlled breeze carrying the definitive scent of a high-end dealership. New leather, cleaning solution, and faintly of coffee. The buzz here was more intense, more focused. A large digital wall cycled through dazzling, silent advertisements. The click of keyboards and the low urgency of sales calls formed a backdrop. A salesman near the entrance glanced up, made brief eye contact, and offered a practiced, neutral nod before his eyes instinctively darted past Taryn, searching for a spouse, a partner, the rest of the story that would make this man a client. Finding none, his attention subtly dissolved. Taryn absorbed it all without reaction. He moved to the centerpiece of the showroom, a luxurious electric SUV on a slowly rotating platform. He stopped, placing his hands lightly behind his back, a scholar before a display. He read the detailed spec sheet, his eyes flicking from the paper to the vehicle's contours, his mind clearly cross-referencing, analyzing. From her elevated glass office that overlooked the entire sales floor, Margaret looked up from her computer monitor. Her eyes, the sharp blue of a winter sky, conducted their own routine scan. They passed over a successful-looking couple negotiating at a desk, a good sight, and then landed on the solitary figure of Taryn, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowed a millimeter. A man, alone, well-dressed, yes, but not ostentatious, browsing with a quiet intensity, not seeking engagement. He did not match the immediate profile of a buyer in her efficient mental catalog. He was an unproductive variable in her equation of daily targets. She watched as he completed his circle of the SUV and withdrew his phone. He didn't take a picture. Instead, his thumbs moved over the screen, typing a note. He looked from the phone to the manufacturer's badge on the wall, his expression one of detached verification. In her office, Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Time was a currency, and floor space was a revenue stream. A browser, especially a solo one, was a potential drain unless quickly converted or moved along. This was not suspicion yet. It was a manager's cold calculus. Taryn put his phone away and turned his attention to a low-slung sports car nearby, his demeanor still one of total, unruffled calm. It was the calm of ownership, of someone who belonged in the most fundamental sense. The sound of a chair rolling back echoed faintly from the office. Margaret stood, smoothing her tailored navy blazer over her silk blouse. She touched a hand to her sleek blonde bob, a gesture of preparation. A minor irregularity had presented itself on her floor, and Margaret was the chief enforcer of order. Her low heels announced her approach with a crisp, authoritative tap on the polished concrete as she exited the office and descended into the showroom arena. The final few feet of her walk were silent. She stopped a respectful but firm distance behind Taryn, who was now leaning slightly to read the small print of the sports car's fuel efficiency rating. The showroom's noise seemed to recede, funneling down to this patch of floor. The sunlight through the windows stretched long, dramatic shadows. Two understandings of authority now occupied the same space, separated only by a breath and a catastrophic misunderstanding. Taryn heard the presence behind him but did not turn. He finished reading the placard and straightened up, his hands sliding casually into his pockets, a picture of waiting patience. He had known this moment was an inevitable part of his unannounced tour. Margaret did not simply occupy the showroom floor, she commanded it. Her walk from her office was a study in controlled authority, a straight-line march that parted the air around her. Salespeople subtly straightened their postures as she passed. A junior finance manager quickly ended a personal call. She was the beating heart of the operation, and everyone knew it. She stopped a precise 3 feet behind Taryn, close enough to assert presence, far enough to maintain professional distance. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she allowed her gaze, cool, appraising, and utterly sure, to sweep over him one more time, confirming her initial assessment. "Can I help you?" Her voice was not loud, but it was a blade. It cut through the ambient showroom noise with a crisp, no-nonsense clarity. The tone was not a question born of hospitality, but a demand for justification. "State your business." Taryn turned slowly, his movement unhurried, as if emerging from a deep thought. He met her eyes, his own expression neutral, polite. He offered a small, courteous smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Just browsing, thank you," he said, his voice even and calm, a soft counterpoint to her sharpness. Margaret's eyes did a second, more deliberate scan. She took in the quality of his shirt, the clean line of his trousers, the good but not flashy shoes. It was the assessment of a seasoned professional, but it was filtered through a lens of immediate utility. Well-dressed browser, her mind categorized, potential time waster. She did not return the smile. Her own lips remained a carefully painted line of coral pink. "Browsing," she repeated, letting the word hang, flat and heavy. "I see." She took a half step to the side, gesturing with a sweep of her hand that encompassed the bustling floor. "We're quite busy with active customers today. If you have a specific model or price range in mind, I can direct you to a member of my team. Otherwise, our display literature is over by the waiting area." The dismissal was artful, layered in the polite language of business. She was offering a path, a lesser, passive path of pamphlets and benches, away from her prime floor space. Her posture, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, communicated that her time, and by extension the dealership's time, was a commodity he was currently borrowing without intent to purchase. Taryn's calm didn't fracture. He nodded slowly as if considering her suggestion. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone still mild. "I'd prefer to look at the vehicles themselves if that's all right. Get a real sense of them." A flicker of impatience crossed Margaret's features, quickly schooled into a mask of strained professionalism. She was a woman who dealt in facts, figures, and closed deals. Browsing was an abstract, a prelude that too often led nowhere. She had quotas humming in the back of her mind like a persistent clock. "Of course," she said, the words tight. "Feel free to look. Just be mindful not to handle the vehicles or interrupt my sales staff. They're here to work with serious buyers." She let the final phrase land with a little extra weight. Serious buyers. The line was drawn. He was on one side, her valuable team and their commissions were on the other. She didn't wait for a response. Her point had been made, her territory marked. With a final, brief glance that swept over him as one might glance at a temporarily misplaced piece of furniture, she turned on her heel. Her heels tapped out a decisive, retreating rhythm as she walked away, her attention already returning to the more fertile ground of a couple examining a minivan. Taryn watched her go for a moment, his thoughtful expression unchanged. He noted the way she immediately approached the couple, her smile switching on bright, warm, and sales ready. A complete transformation from the chilly auditor she had been with him. He saw the salesperson who had been with them defer to her instantly, stepping back to let the manager work. He turned back to the sports car, but his attention was no longer on the horsepower or the leather seats. He reached into his pocket and pulled his phone out again. This time, he typed a longer note, his thumbs moving steadily. He wasn't jotting down car specs. He was recording a behavioral observation. Across the floor, Margaret, now laughing politely at something the husband said, cast a fleeting look over the wife's shoulder. Her eyes found Taryn again, phone in hand, seemingly documenting the car. Her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. In her world, a man taking notes on a car without a salesperson usually meant one thing. He was a comparison shopper, gathering information to use as leverage elsewhere. The lowest form of browser. She finished with the couple, directing them to her salesperson for a test drive with a confident pat on the man's shoulder. Her mission there was accomplished. Her gaze then tracked back to Taryn, who had moved to a family sedan, repeating his routine. A slow circle, a study of the placard, a typed note. He was consistent. He was calm. And he was, in her view, consuming valuable oxygen in her ecosystem without any clear sign of reciprocation. A problem, however small, that was not resolving itself. A static variable in her dynamic equation of daily sales. Her fingers tapped once sharply against the side of her leg. A decision was crystallizing. The polite manager had given way to the protective enforcer. The first, subtle attempt to redirect him had failed. The next step would need to be more direct. She took a deep, steadying breath, the kind taken before executing an unpleasant but necessary task. The friendly glow she'd used with the couple was gone, replaced by the cool, clear focus of a surgeon. She straightened her blazer once more and began her second approach. This time, her footsteps were slower, heavier. The tap of her heels was not just sound, it was a declaration. The atmosphere around her seemed to chill by a degree as she closed the distance between them. Her target once again the tall, quiet man who dared to browse with such purposeful serenity. The warmth of the late sun streaming through the showroom's floor-to-ceiling windows did nothing to thaw the space that was rapidly forming around Margaret. Her return march across the floor was not just a walk, it was a reclamation. The energy of the room seemed to bend toward her, the low hum of business dimming by a perceptible degree as employees sensed a shift in the manager's focus. Taryn heard her approach this time, the deliberate, measured tap, tap, tap that spoke of intent, not mere passage. He finished typing a note on his phone, slid it back into his pocket, and turned to face her just as she came to a halt before him, her arms now crossed loosely over her blazer. It was a pose of casual authority, but her eyes were anything but casual. "Finding everything you need?" she asked. Her voice had shed the last vestiges of performative politeness. It was now a flat, efficient instrument. "Quite an impressive lineup," Taryn replied, his tone diplomatic. His hands rested easily at his sides. "You've got a good mix of inventory here. The new electric models seem to be drawing a lot of interest." He gestured toward the family he'd seen earlier, now climbing into the minivan with a salesperson. It was an attempt to connect, to show he was observing the business, not just the metal. Margaret did not follow his gesture. Her gaze remained locked on him, unblinking. She had not come for small talk about inventory trends. "They are," she stated, the words clipped. "But those models require a serious conversation about financing and availability. They're not just for casual observation." The pause before casual observation was microscopic but potent. She let the phrase hang, her meaning clear. What he was doing was casual. What her team did was serious. Taryn's head tilted slightly, a spark of deeper interest finally lighting in his eyes. Not anger, curiosity. "Is there a problem with observing the vehicles?" "I was under the impression this was a showroom." "It is a place of business," Margaret corrected swiftly, her chin lifting a fraction. "My business is converting foot traffic into sales. Your business, so far, appears to be touring." She said the word as if it were synonymous with loitering. "You've been here for 20 minutes, moving from car to car, making notes. Do you have a question for one of my salespeople? A specific vehicle you'd like to discuss?" This was her tactic, boxing him in, forcing him to either declare intent as a buyer or reveal himself as a spectator who had overstayed his welcome. It was a standard pressure move, one she'd used countless times to separate the serious from the curious. But it was delivered with a frost that suggested she'd already sorted him into the latter category. Taryn considered her for a long moment. The muffled sounds of a deal being celebrated at a nearby desk, a handshake, a laugh drifted over, highlighting the contrast in their silent standoff. "I have questions," he said calmly, "but they aren't about trim packages or APR rates." Margaret's brow arched. "Then what are they about?" "About flow," he said, his eyes scanning the room briefly before returning to hers. "About customer engagement, about the difference between being greeted and being assessed." The statement was so far outside the script of a typical customer interaction that it momentarily threw her. Her composure flickered. This wasn't a man angling for a discount or confused about a warranty. This was something else, something she couldn't immediately categorize, and that unnerved her. Her mind raced. Corporate spy, undercover shopper from a competitor. The possibilities were few and all of them irritating. "I assure you," she said, her voice regaining its edge, colder now, "every person who walks through that door is assessed. It's how we determine how best to help them, and based on my assessment, you are not here to buy a car today, are you?" It was a direct challenge. Lay your cards on the table. Taryn didn't flinch. "And if I'm not ready to buy this very second, does that mean I don't belong in the showroom, that I'm not a potential customer?" Margaret exhaled through her nose, a short, impatient sound. She was losing patience with the philosophical debate. "It means we prioritize our time and resources on clients with immediate needs. We have families, working people, ready to make decisions." She uncrossed her arms and made a small, shooing gesture with her hand, not at him, but toward the general world outside the glass walls. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable reviewing our inventory online, where you can browse at your leisure. Then when you're serious, you can come back with questions for my team." The dismissal was now absolute and tangible. She wasn't just suggesting the waiting area. She was suggesting he leave entirely and reconfigure his approach to her kingdom. A deep silence stretched between them. Taryn looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the absolute certainty in her stance, the unshakable belief in the rightness of her system. She wasn't being cruel for cruelty's sake. She was being efficient, and in her mind, his presence was inefficiency personified. The tragedy, he realized, was that she believed she was doing her job well. Finally, he gave a slow, single nod. Not a nod of agreement, but of acknowledgement. He had his answer. "Online just doesn't give you the same feel for a place, though, does it?" he said, his voice almost conversational. "You can't sense the culture." The word culture seemed to bounce off her. It was a soft, intangible thing. She dealt in units sold, dollars financed, quotas met. "The culture here is one of success and professionalism," she stated, as if reading from a mission statement. "And that professionalism requires me to manage the floor effectively. Now I have to ask you directly, are you planning to speak to a salesperson about a vehicle purchase in the next 15 minutes? The final ultimatum, the line in the sand." Taryn held her gaze, his own calm now feeling less like passivity and more like a deep, steady pressure. "No," he said plainly, "I am not." A flash of vindication mixed with annoyance crossed Margaret's face. There it was, confirmation. She had been right all along. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to conclude your tour," she said, the word dripping with finality. She gestured toward the exit. "We need the space for our customer. Thank you for your interest in South Point Motors." She didn't say, please. She didn't say, I'm sorry. It was a command delivered with the sterile courtesy of a security guard. She expected compliance. The script in her experience ended here. The browser would mutter, perhaps shoot a resentful glance and depart. But Taryn didn't move. He simply stood, a quiet, immovable object in the path of her unquestioned authority. The first crack in her perfectly managed day had just appeared, and it was refusing to be paved over. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, Taryn simply stood. He didn't glare, didn't protest, didn't move. He absorbed Margaret's directive as if it were a curious piece of data, his expression one of profound, analytical disappointment. This stillness, this refusal to comply with the expected social script of shame and retreat, was more disconcerting to Margaret than any argument. The triumph she'd felt at his no curdled into something sharper, affront. Her authority, so cleanly asserted, had been met not with submission, but with a silent, potent disregard. The air between them grew charged, static with the unsaid. I said, Margaret repeated, her voice lowering into a register of controlled threat, each word a chip of ice. We need the space. You need to leave. She took a single, deliberate step forward, invading the bubble of personal space he'd maintained. It was a tactical move, meant to intimidate, to force a physical reaction. Taryn finally moved, but only to slightly shift his weight, grounding himself. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the showroom once more. A young salesman, Kyle, was pretending to study a brochure but was clearly watching the scene from the corner of his eye. A receptionist had stopped typing. The showroom's background noise, the click of keys, the murmur of talks had dulled, replaced by a listening silence. You need the space, Taryn echoed, his voice still calm, but now it carried a new, firmer texture. But as I look around, I see 3 available sales desks. I see 2 salespeople by the coffee station. I see ample space. He looked back at her, his eyes direct. This isn't about space, is it? Margaret's cheeks flushed with a sudden hot prickling. He was deconstructing her premise in front of an invisible audience. She felt exposed, her professional logic laid bare and found wanting. Anger, hot and immediate, surged to cover the vulnerability. It is about the appropriate use of space, she fired back, her composure cracking at the edges. And of my team's time, which you are wasting. Wasting, Taryn repeated the key word. By looking at the products you have for sale, by taking notes on your inventory. In what business model is that considered wasting time? Isn't that the precursor to a sale? The precursor to a sale is a conversation, Margaret snapped, her hand slicing through the air. A conversation you have explicitly refused to have. You are not engaging. You are scouting. And I know what that means. Ah, there it was. Core suspicion finally voiced. It wasn't just that he was a browser. It was the type of browser she had decided he was. Taryn's head tilted again, that gesture of deep curiosity. What does it mean, Margaret? He used her name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips, spoken with such calm familiarity, seemed to jolt her. What do you think I'm doing? She leaned in, her voice dropping to a harsh, confidential whisper meant to carry just to him, but which pierced the quiet room. I think you're from a competitor, or you're some kind of consultant. You're gathering information, pricing, specs to take elsewhere. You're not a customer, you're a thief of time and intellectual property. The accusation hung in the air, monstrous and definitive. Thief. She had named her demon, and in doing so she had fully committed. There was no stepping back from this. Her entire stance now justified itself on this belief. A profound sadness flickered in Taryn's eyes, replacing the curiosity. It was the sadness of confirmation, of seeing a deep flaw not just in action but in character. "So that's the assumption," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, yet it carried with startling clarity. "A black man in a nice shirt looking carefully taking notes. He can't be a potential buyer. He must be a spy. A thief." Margaret recoiled as if physically struck. The color drained from her face, replaced by a blotchy red. "This has nothing to do with that," she hissed, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and a dawning, terrifying fear. She had not said that, she would never say that. But he had drawn the line from her actions to the unspoken truth, and the connection was suddenly, glaringly obvious to every listening ear in the room. "This is about your behavior, your refusal to state your purpose." "My purpose is my own," Taryn stated, his calm now feeling like an immense, unassailable wall. "And I have every right to be here observing for as long as I choose. This is a public showroom. I am causing no disturbance. I am touching nothing. I am speaking to no one unless spoken to, until you approached me." He was laying out the facts of the situation with the precision of a lawyer, and each fact made her position seem smaller, more petty, more prejudiced. "You are causing a disturbance now," Margaret countered, her voice rising, betraying her panic. She gestured vaguely around them at the frozen employees, the customers who had paused their own conversations to watch. "You are disrupting my staff. You are creating a scene because you won't accept a simple, reasonable request to leave." It was a masterful, if desperate, pivot. She was reframing the narrative. He was no longer the subject of her accusation. He was the instigator of a disruption, the cause of the very scene she was perpetuating. Taryn actually smiled then, a small, weary smile that held no warmth. "I am not the one who raised my voice. I am not the one making accusations. I am simply standing here. You are the one creating the scene, Margaret. You have been since the moment you decided I didn't belong." The verbal trap snapped shut around her. He had mirrored her actions back to her, and in the reflection she saw not the efficient manager but an escalating aggressor. Her breath came short. She was losing control of the situation, losing the moral high ground, losing face in front of her entire team. The feeling was intolerable. She had to regain control. Immediately. If reason and authority wouldn't move him, then she would escalate to a power he could not ignore. Her eyes, glittering with frustration and humiliated rage, locked onto his. All pretense of professionalism vaporized. "Fine," she said, the word a sharp, final exhalation. "You want to stand there. You think this is a game. We'll see how you stand when the authorities decide who belongs here." The word authorities landed like a gavel. The silent showroom seemed to flinch as one. Kyle, the young salesman, looked down at his shoes, his face pale. The accusation had been bad, but this, calling the police, was a nuclear option. It transformed an uncomfortable managerial dispute into something dark, official, and potentially dangerous. Margaret held Taryn's gaze, challenging him to back down now, to finally understand the seriousness of her will. Taryn did not blink. He gave one more slow, deliberate nod. "Okay," he said, his voice impossibly, infuriatingly even. "If that's how you want to handle this." The gauntlet was not just thrown, it was accepted. The point of no return had been spectacularly crossed. Margaret turned on her heel, her stride rigid with fury, and marched toward the reception desk to pick up the phone. The quiet was now a thick, dread-filled blanket over South Point Motors. The accusation had been made, and its consequences were now irrevocably in motion. The click of Margaret's heels against the polished floor was the only sound, a metronome of fury marking her passage to the reception desk. Every eye in the showroom followed her, wide with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. The pretense of work had ceased entirely. A salesman halfway through a financing calculation had frozen, his pen hovering over the paperwork. The elderly couple by the sedan had stopped their conversation, their expressions etched with concern. Taryn did not watch her go. He turned slowly, presenting his back to her retreating form, and faced the luxury SUV once more. He placed his hands behind his back, resuming his earlier posture of observation. It was an act of supreme, almost surreal defiance. The storm was breaking, and he was calmly studying the architecture. At the desk, Margaret snatched the receiver from its cradle. The plastic crack of the handset being lifted was startlingly loud. Her fingers, usually so steady when pointing out figures on a contract, trembled slightly as she punched in the 3 digits. 911. South Point Motors on Grand Avenue, she said into the phone, her voice a tightly controlled wire. She did not shout, but each word was sharpened to a point, designed to convey urgency and command. Yes, I need an officer sent to the premises, immediately. She paused, listening. Her gaze was fixed on a spot on the wall, avoiding the stares of her employees. There is an individual here, she continued, her tone dropping into a confidential, grave register. He is refusing to leave the private business premises after being asked repeatedly. He is uncooperative, potentially disruptive. She chose her adjectives with care, painting a specific, threatening picture for the dispatcher. Individual, refusing, uncooperative, disruptive. None were lies, but together they formed a portrait of a menace. Another pause, she nodded stiffly. No weapons that I can see, but he is causing alarm among my staff and customers. We need him removed. A final, curt, thank you, and she hung up. The receiver landed in its cradle with a decisive thunk that echoed in the silence. The deed was done. The line to the outside world, to official power, had been activated. Margaret took a deep, steadying breath, squaring her shoulders. When she turned back to face the showroom floor, a mask of resolved authority had settled over her features. The flush of anger was still there, but it was now channeled into a cold, righteous certainty. She had followed the protocol. She had been forced to take this step. She began her walk back to where Taryn stood, her pace slower, now regal. She was no longer just the manager, she was the executor of order. The employee's eyes darted from her to Taryn's implacable back and then to the floor, a silent game of tennis no one wanted to play. She stopped a few feet from him. He did not turn. "The police are on their way," she announced, her voice clear and projecting, ensuring everyone in earshot could hear. It was both a warning to him and a reassurance to her team. "See, I am handling it. They will be here shortly. I suggest you save yourself further embarrassment and wait outside for them." Taryn finally moved. He turned to face her, his expression unchanged, a placid lake after she had thrown her largest stone. He studied her face, taking in the triumphant set of her jaw, the glitter in her eyes. "Why would I wait outside?" he asked, his tone one of genuine, almost academic inquiry. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not trespassing until you formally ask me to leave, which, I'll note, you still haven't done with any legal precision. You've just demanded and accused." His calm citation of procedure was a direct attack on her sense of control. It suggested he knew the rules of this game as well as, if not better than, she did. "You are trespassing now," she insisted, her voice rising despite herself. "By your continued presence after my request. This is private property, and I am the manager." "My word is the request." "Is it?" Taryn asked softly. He took a single step toward her, not threateningly, but to close the distance for a more private conversation. The movement made her instinctively stiffen. "Is your word law here, Margaret, to be obeyed without question, to judge who belongs and who doesn't based on a feeling?" "It's not a feeling," she shot back in a heated whisper. "It's a professional assessment. You are not a customer." "And you are not a judge," he replied, his voice dropping to match hers but lacking its heat. It was chilling in its certainty. "You're a manager, and from what I've seen today, a poor one. You see threats where there are none. You see theft in curiosity. You've turned a showroom into a tense little kingdom where you've decided I'm the villain, all because I didn't follow your script." He shook his head, that profound sadness returning to his eyes. "You called the police, Margaret. You escalated a situation you created into a potential crisis. For what? To prove a point. To prove you have the power to make a man in a nice shirt leave." Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His words were arrows, each finding a chink in the armor of her righteousness. The narrative was shifting under her feet again. He was reframing her decisive action as a petty, catastrophic overreaction. The distant, two-tone warble of a police siren sliced through the tension, growing rapidly closer. It was the sound of her impending victory, but it suddenly felt hollow, tainted by his quiet condemnation. A visible shudder of relief went through the staff. The cavalry was coming. The uncomfortable moral ambiguity of the standoff was about to be resolved by an external, unquestionable authority. They would take the man away and order would be restored. Simple. Taryn heard the siren too. He didn't look toward the door. He kept his eyes on Margaret, watching the complex play of emotions on her face. The relief, the lingering anger, the first faint ghost of doubt she would not yet acknowledge. "They're here," she said, her voice regaining some of its brittle strength. The sound of the siren was her validation. "Now we'll see how calmly you observe." Two sleek black and white patrol cars pulled into view through the glass front, their light bars flashing silent, rhythmic blue and red pulses that painted the showroom walls in dizzying arcs. The automatic doors hissed open. "Handle it my way," Margaret whispered to Taryn, the phrase a final, vindictive mantra, as two uniformed police officers stepped into the bright, tense silence of South Point Motors. The arrival of the police was a sensory shock. The silent, swirling dance of red and blue lights bled through the showroom glass, painting the faces of the gleaming cars and the stunned onlookers in surreal, pulsing hues. The two officers who entered were a study in contrasting physicality but shared the same neutral, assessing demeanor. Officer Vasquez, tall and broad-shouldered, and Officer Reed, shorter, with sharp, observant eyes. Their footsteps, heavy and official on the tile, seemed to finalize the transition. This was no longer an internal dispute. It was a civil matter, now under the jurisdiction of the state. A profound, brittle silence gripped the room, broken only by the faint electronic crackle from one officer's shoulder radio. Margaret immediately stepped forward, her posture transforming into one of pained, professional relief. She was the responsible citizen, forced to summon help. She pointed a decisive finger at Taryn, who had not moved from his spot beside the SUV. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she began, her voice calibrated to be respectful yet firm. This is the individual. He has been on the premises for over half an hour, refusing to engage with sales staff, and when asked multiple times politely to leave, he has refused. He's disrupting our business and making my employees and customers uncomfortable. Her summary was efficient. It framed Taryn as an inert, stubborn obstacle, individual, refusing, disrupting. The words from her 911 call were now given flesh in her testimony. Officer Vasquez gave a slow nod, his gaze shifting from Margaret to Taryn. "Sir," he said, his tone carefully even, "no judgment yet. Can you tell us your side of things?" All eyes swiveled to Taryn. This was the moment. He would either erupt in defensive anger, justifying Margaret's narrative of a disruptive person, or he would crumble under the pressure of the law. He did neither. Taryn turned fully to face the officers, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He offered a small, polite nod. "Of course, officer. My name is Taryn." His voice was calm, clear, and carried a quiet respect for their presence. "I entered this dealership today as any member of the public might. I've been looking at the vehicles, taking notes for my own consideration. I have not been approached by a salesperson until the manager, Ms. Margaret, decided my presence was unwelcome." He paused, letting the factual correction hang in the air. He had not refused to engage with sales staff. He had been engaged only by the manager and in a hostile manner. "When she asked me to leave," he continued, "I asked on what grounds. She stated I wasn't a serious buyer and was wasting time. I maintained that I had every right to be in a public showroom. She then accused me of being a thief or a corporate spy." He delivered this last part without a hint of theatrics, as simply the next step in the sequence. A subtle ripple went through the small audience. Thief. He had said the word aloud to the police. Kyle, the young salesman, swallowed hard, looking at the floor. Margaret's mouth tightened. "I said he was acting like one, gathering information with no intent to buy," she interjected, her voice strained. Officer Reed held up a placating hand. "Ma'am, we'll get to you in a moment." His eyes remained on Taryn. "Sir, is it your intention to purchase a vehicle here today?" It was the same question Margaret had asked, but from the police it carried a different weight. It was a practical question about intent and trespass. Taryn met Officer Reed's gaze. "It is not my primary intention today, no. My intention was to observe the operations and the inventory. But does that legally constitute trespassing? I've touched nothing. I've harassed no one. I've simply existed here more quietly than most." He wasn't arguing, he was questioning, forcing a legal and logical clarity that Margaret's emotional reasoning had bypassed. Officer Vasquez exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with his partner. They dealt with clear-cut trespassers, the belligerent, the intoxicated, the clearly destructive. This was something else. This was a man of obvious poise challenging the premise of his removal on grounds of mere suspicion. "Sir," Officer Vasquez said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more explanatory, "if the manager of a private business asks you to leave and you refuse, that can constitute trespass. It's their right to refuse service to anyone." "Understood," Taryn said, nodding as if appreciating the lesson. "And has she formally refused me service? Or has she refused my presence? She never offered me service to refuse. She only demanded I cease my passive observation and depart." Is browsing now a crime, officer? Or is it only a crime when the manager decides the browser doesn't look like he should be able to buy what he's browsing? The question, delivered with lethal calm, landed in the center of the room. It stripped away the pretense of procedure and exposed the raw, ugly nerve beneath. The elderly couple by the sedan looked at each other, their faces filled with dawning understanding and discomfort. Margaret paled. "That is not what this is about." Her voice verged on shrill. Taryn ignored her, keeping his focus on the officers. He was not arguing with her anymore. He was presenting a case to a higher authority. "I have been calm. I have been compliant with every lawful instruction. My only crime is that I did not obey an order rooted in a personal and frankly prejudicial assumption. If you order me to leave on that basis, I will, of course, comply with your lawful authority. But I want it noted why I am being made to leave." He was boxing them in ethically. They could enforce the trespass, but he was ensuring the moral context. The why would stain the action. The officers were silent for a long moment. The flashing lights from their cruisers still painted the walls, a constant reminder of the escalated reality. Officer Reed rubbed his chin, looking from Taryn's composed face to Margaret's flushed and furious one. The showroom was a vacuum, holding its breath. Officer Vasquez finally spoke, his voice low. "Ma'am, perhaps, given the circumstances, a formal trespass warning is a bit extreme. If the gentleman agrees to leave now, we can consider the matter resolved." It was a peace offering, a dignified off-ramp, a way for Margaret to get what she wanted without the ugliness of a formal removal. But the offer was a defeat. It meant the police saw her actions as extreme. It validated Taryn's calm and questioned her judgment. Her victory, summoned with the wail of sirens, was turning to ash. She saw it in the faces of her staff, no longer just scared, but now tinged with something like pity or embarrassment. She saw it in the stony patience of Taryn, who had never raised his voice, never made a threat, and had still somehow won. The waiting game was over, and she had lost the only round that mattered, the moral one. The officers waited for her response, their presence now feeling less like a shield and more like a mirror, reflecting a scene that was profoundly, unprofessionally wrong. The officer's suggestion, a quiet resolution, a face-saving exit, hung in the air like a lifeline thrown into churning waters. For a second, Margaret's face flickered with the temptation to grab it, to end this nightmare, to have him gone and restore the hollow echo of her authority. But her eyes met Taryn's, and in his unwavering calm, she saw not submission, but a verdict. Accepting this compromise would be an admission that he had been right to question her. It would be a whispered confession heard by every employee in the room. The stain on her authority would be permanent. Pride, hot and corrosive, flooded her veins, burning away the last flicker of managerial sense. She had summoned the power of the state. She would wield it to its fullest conclusion. She would have her unambiguous victory. "No," she said, the word cutting through the tense silence. Her voice was tight but resolute. "No, officer," he was asked. He refused. He continues to refuse. "I want him formally trespassed from the property. I want it documented. I will press charges if necessary." The words "press charges" were a thunderclap. Kyle, the young salesman, physically flinched. The elderly husband put a protective arm around his wife's shoulders. This was no longer about a man lingering. This was about the full, punitive weight of the law being invoked over a showroom disagreement. Officer Vasquez's neutral expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He had offered a path to de-escalation. It had been refused. Protocol now bound him. "Ma'am, are you certain? A formal trespass order is a legal document. It bans him from the premises." "I am the manager," Margaret stated, drawing herself up to her full height, reclaiming the mantle she felt slipping. "And he is not welcome, I am certain." Both officers looked at Taryn. A formal trespass order changed things. It was a direct command they would be obligated to enforce with physical removal if he resisted. Taryn had watched this internal drama play out on Margaret's face. He saw the moment she chose the path of total war. The profound sadness in his eyes deepened, but there was no surprise. He gave the officers a slow, acknowledging nod, as if releasing them from any moral quandary. Their job was now clear. "Sir," Officer Reed said, his tone formalizing, "you've heard the manager. She is formally asking you to leave the premises of South Point Motors. If you do not leave now, you will be subject to arrest for criminal trespass. This is your final warning." Every syllable was measured and heavy with consequence. The blue and red lights continued their silent, dizzying spin, casting jagged shadows across Taryn's face. This was the precipice. This was where Margaret had willed them all to stand. She held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Now, she thought. Now you break. Now you finally understand who is in control. Taryn took a slow, deep breath. He looked around the showroom one last time, at the cars, at the frozen employees, at the couple whose day out had turned into this spectacle. His gaze finally settled back on Margaret, and in it she saw not fear but a kind of weary finality. "I understand," he said, his voice still impossibly even. "And I will, of course, comply with a lawful order." A jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph shot through Margaret. Yes, he was capitulating, he was leaving, she had won. The rigid tension in her shoulders began to unclench. But Taryn wasn't moving toward the door. Instead, he raised one hand, a gesture asking for a moment of patience. "Before I go, officers, and to ensure there is no further confusion or wasted time," he said, his words deliberate, "there is one piece of information relevant to this trespass that needs to be clarified." Margaret's triumph stuttered. Clarification. What could he possibly clarify? Excuses, please. Taryn reached slowly, deliberately into the inner breast pocket of his shirt. His movements were calm and transparent, ensuring the officers saw no threat. He withdrew a slim, black leather wallet. Confusion knitted Officer Vasquez's brow. "Sir, identification is not the issue here. The issue is the manager's request for you to leave." "I understand," Taryn repeated softly. He opened the wallet. Instead of a driver's license, he extracted a single, crisp, folded piece of heavy bond paper. It had been folded in thirds, sharp creases suggesting importance. He held it delicately between his thumb and forefinger. "This," he said, his voice now carrying a new, quiet authority that seemed to still the very air in the room, "is the final purchase and acquisition agreement for South Point Motors, including all assets, properties, and holdings." He extended the paper toward Officer Vasquez. "The sale was finalized and recorded with the county clerk 3 days ago. My signature is next to the seller S. I am the new legal owner of this dealership." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the sound from the world. The flashing lights seemed to slow, their rhythmic pulse stretching into eternity. Officer Vasquez stared at the folded paper, then at Taryn's face. He did not take it immediately. The sheer, staggering improbability of the statement required a moment to process. Margaret made a sound, a short, choked gasp that was neither word nor breath. Her brain refused to assemble the syllables into a coherent meaning. Owner, purchase agreement, his signature. The words bounced around her skull like shrapnel, tearing through every assumption, every justification, every layer of her authority. "I what?" she whispered, the sound lost in the vast silence. Officer Reed was the first to move. He stepped forward and gently took the document from Taryn's hand. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He looked for the key points: the business name, the legal description, the signatures, the notary seal, the official filing stamp from the county recorder's office. His eyes widened fractionally. He held it so his partner could see. Officer Vasquez leaned in. His lips moved silently as he read the relevant lines. He looked from the paper to Taryn, his professional neutrality dissolving into sheer, undisguised astonishment. He slowly straightened up, handing the document back to Taryn with a newfound, almost deferential care. He turned to Margaret. Her face was a mask of blanched horror, her mouth agape, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. "Ma'am," Officer Vasquez said, his voice now thick with a potent mix of apology and admonishment. "It appears there's been a significant misunderstanding." The axis of the universe had just tilted. The man she had accused, dismissed, and summoned the police to eject was not a thief of time. He was the owner of all the time. He owned the very ground she stood on. The authorities had arrived, but they were no longer here for him. The folded document in Taryn's hand was no longer just a piece of paper. In the stunned silence of the showroom, it had become an artifact of profound, irreversible truth. The flashing police lights, which moments before had signaled his impending removal, now felt like a garish spotlight on Margaret's catastrophic error. Officer Vasquez's statement, "a significant misunderstanding," echoed in the vacuum, a masterful understatement that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. Margaret stood utterly still. The world had not just shifted, it had inverted. The solid floor of her authority had dissolved into a void. She stared at Taryn, her mind a white noise of denial. This was a trick, a forgery, an elaborate, cruel joke. But the officer's transformed demeanor, the shock on Reed's face, the apologetic gravity in Vasquez's posture, confirmed its dreadful authenticity. Taryn accepted the returned document, refolding it with deliberate care and slipping it back into his wallet. The simple, precise action was a performance of ownership. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply let the new reality settle, heavy and absolute, onto the shoulders of everyone present. He finally turned his full attention to Margaret. The calm in his eyes was no longer just patience. It was the terrifying calm of judgment deferred, now delivered. "You," Margaret's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. She tried again, her throat constricting. "You're the owner." The word owner felt alien on her tongue, a title belonging to the distant, faceless entity that signed her paychecks, not to the man she had just tried to have arrested. "As of 4:32 p.m. last Wednesday," Taryn confirmed, his voice quiet but crystal clear in the hush. He stated it as a simple fact, a timestamp on her professional obituary. "The previous owner, Mr. Danvers, and I closed the deal in his lawyer's office." The transition was to be communicated to senior management this coming Monday. He paused, letting the implication land. "I decided to visit my new business a few days early, to see it, to feel it, unannounced." Each word was a hammer blow. My new business, unannounced. He had not been spying, he had been taking possession. Her accusations of theft were not just wrong, they were a perverse parody of the truth. He hadn't been stealing information, he was auditing his property. Officer Reed cleared his throat, awkwardly shifting his weight. "Sir, under the circumstances, we'll obviously be leaving you to handle this internally. Our apologies for the intrusion." Taryn gave a small, gracious nod. "No apology necessary, officers. You were acting on the information you were given. I appreciate your professionalism." The distinction was brutal. They were professional. The person who had given them the information, Margaret, was not. The officers, visibly eager to exit the uncomfortable scene, offered terse nods and made their way back to the glass doors. The retreating wail of their sirens being turned off outside sounded like a final, mournful note on the whole disastrous affair. The normal showroom light, now absent of the swirling blues and reds, seemed harsh and exposing. Margaret remained frozen, her mind scrambling for footing that no longer existed. The script had been obliterated. What did you say to the man you had just publicly branded a criminal, who now held your career in his hands? Her managerial playbook contained no chapter for this. Taryn took a step toward her. The employees who had been statues now seemed to lean in unconsciously, drawn by the gravitational pull of the moment. "You asked for my purpose, Margaret," he said, his voice low for her and the immediately surrounding air alone, yet it carried to every straining ear. "It wasn't to steal. It was to learn. To learn about the people who run this place, the culture." He gestured slightly, encompassing the silent, watching staff. "The culture you foster." He let his gaze sweep the room, making brief, pointed eye contact with Kyle, who looked down, ashamed, with the receptionist, who offered a tiny, sympathetic wince. "I saw a team on edge," Taryn continued, turning back to her. "I saw customers glancing over, sensing tension. I saw a manager so convinced of her own right to judge who belonged that she saw a threat in simple observation. You were so busy protecting your fiefdom from imagined spies, you failed to see the owner standing in front of you." Margaret flinched as if struck. Her face, which had been pale, now flushed with a deep, mortified crimson. The foundation of her entire identity, the efficient, no-nonsense manager, the protector of the dealership, had been revealed as a brittle facade built on prejudice and paranoia. I didn't know," she whispered, the weak defense sounding pathetic even to her own ears. "That's the point," Taryn said, and for the first time a sliver of heat entered his tone. "You didn't know. You didn't ask. You assumed. You assumed I had no legitimate purpose here. You assumed I was a drain on your resources. You assumed your judgment of who constitutes a serious buyer was infallible. And every single one of your assumptions was not just wrong, it was catastrophically, insultingly wrong." He took another step closer. She could see the fine weave of his shirt, the steady, controlled rise and fall of his chest. His proximity was overwhelming. "You called the police, Margaret," he said, the words dropping like stones. "You looked at me, a man committing the crime of looking at cars while black, and you saw a criminal. You saw a problem to be removed by armed officers. Do you have any idea what you set in motion today? Any idea at all?" The question hung unanswerable. It connected her actions to a vast, terrible history she had deliberately ignored. It framed her not just as a bad manager, but as something far uglier in the cold light of truth. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The reveal was complete. It was not just a reveal of ownership, but a reveal of character. His and hers. His, laid bare as steady, principled, and formidable. Hers, exposed as small, prejudiced, and utterly broken. The power in the room had not just changed hands. It had been annihilated and reborn in a new form. And Margaret was left standing in the wreckage of her own making, naked under the gaze of her new boss and her former subordinates, with nowhere left to hide. The silence after Taryn's final question was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Margaret felt its weight pressing down on her, compressing her lungs, making her tremors more violent. The grand, modern showroom, once the stage for her authority, now felt like a courtroom where she stood condemned. Every gleaming car, every polished surface reflected her humiliation. The employees were no longer an audience. They were witnesses. Taryn did not advance further. He didn't need to. The space between them was charged with the undeniable truth he had laid bare. He simply watched her, his expression now stripped of its earlier analytical curiosity. What remained was a profound, weary disappointment and a resolve as hard as granite. Margaret stammered, the words glue in her mouth. There was a protocol for unidentified persons. It was a ghost of an argument, the last shred of her procedural manual clinging to her drowning mind. A protocol for trespassers, Taryn corrected, his voice quiet but absolute. Not for customers. Not for owners. You created a category for me the moment I walked in and you never once re-evaluated it. That's not protocol, that's prejudice. And it is toxic to any business, especially one that depends on welcoming the public. He finally broke his gaze from her, turning to address the room. His voice lifted, not to a shout, but to a clear, carrying tone that brooked no interruption. What happened here today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. It was the culmination of a culture where appearance is mistaken for intent, where judgment replaces curiosity, and where the person in charge sees threats instead of people. He looked at Kyle, who met his eyes for a second before looking down, his face tight with shame. Some of you saw this happening. You felt the discomfort, and you said nothing. Because the culture here didn't just permit this behavior from the top, it expected your silence. He then turned his attention back to Margaret, who seemed to shrink with every word. You built this culture, Margaret. You are its architect. You taught your team through your actions every day who was worthy of their time and who was not. Today you gave them the master class, and in doing so you failed them. You failed this business, and you failed me. The word failed landed with finality. It was the verdict. Margaret's breath hitched. A desperate survival instinct cut through the shock. Please, she whispered, the word ragged. I've given this dealership 10 years of my life. My numbers, my sales records, they're the best in the region. She was clawing at the past, trying to build a barricade of old achievements against the tidal wave of the present. And that, Taryn said with a sorrow that was almost pitying, is what makes this so tragic. You were competent at moving metal. You were adept at closing deals. But you were a failure at the one thing that matters more than any quarterly report: basic human respect. You cultivated an environment where this, he gestured between the two of them, encompassing the entire confrontation, could not only happen but seemed to you like the correct course of action. I cannot and I will not build a future for this company on a foundation that is this rotten. He let the statement hang, allowing its meaning to crystallize for everyone. The future. He was talking about the future, and she was not in it. Margaret's eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. They were not tears of remorse for Taryn, but of sheer, panicked loss of status, of identity, of a decade of her life. You're firing me." The question was a gasp. I am relieving you of your duties as general manager of South Point Motors, effective immediately, Taryn stated, his tone formal, clean, devoid of malice. It was a simple statement of fact, more devastating for its lack of anger. Your conduct today represents a fundamental breach of trust and a liability I cannot ignore. HR will be in touch regarding the terms of your severance and the return of company property. The clinical, corporate language was the final blow. She was not being cast out in a dramatic fury, she was being processed, erased from the system she had once ruled. A low, collective inhale came from the staff. The finality of it, the swift, unappealable justice of it, left them stunned. Kyle closed his eyes. "Please," Margaret begged again, taking an unsteady step forward, her hand reaching out slightly before dropping limply to her side. "Taryn, mister, I can learn, I can change." The promises were empty and they both knew it. Change should have happened the moment she saw a calm black man with a notepad. It hadn't. Taryn looked at her for a long, final moment. He saw the crumbling facade, the raw panic, the utter destruction of the woman who had greeted him with such cold certainty. He felt no vengeance, only a somber necessity. "What you learn from this," he said, his voice dropping again for her alone, "is your journey, but you will not learn it here. This dealership is no longer your classroom. Take this lesson with you. Let it change how you move through the world. That is the only positive thing that can come from today." He then gestured calmly, firmly, toward the entrance, not with the dismissive flick she had used on him, but with the finality of a concluded matter. "Security will see you out to collect your personal effects from your office. I'd like you to leave the showroom now." It was over. There were no more words to be wrung from the stone. The reckoning was complete. Margaret's shoulders slumped in total defeat. The tears spilled over, tracing lines through her carefully applied makeup. She didn't look at the staff, couldn't bear their pity or their silent judgment. With a last, shattered glance at the man who had unmasked her and undone her life in one quiet afternoon, she turned. Her heels, which had clicked with such authoritative purpose hours before, now made a soft, shuffling scrape against the floor as she walked toward the doors. A manager no more, escorted by the silent, looming presence of a security guard who had appeared from the back offices. The doors hissed open, and she passed through them, leaving behind the gleaming empire she had lost, not to a corporate raider or a market crash, but to her own reflection in a stranger's calm, unforgiving eyes. The automatic doors hissed shut behind Margaret, sealing her exit. The sound was a full stop, final and absolute. For a moment the showroom remained in suspended animation, a diorama of shock. The employees stood frozen, not yet believing the seismic shift that had just concluded. The only movement was the gentle rotation of the flagship SUV on its platform, a silent, oblivious carousel. Taryn stood at the epicenter, the weight of the confrontation still hanging on him, but his posture was no longer that of an observer or a defendant. It was of a commander surveying a field after a difficult but necessary battle. He took a deep, deliberate breath, centering himself, letting the charged air settle. He then turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his staff. He saw fear, uncertainty, embarrassment, and a flicker of something else, a hesitant, desperate hope. These were people who had just witnessed their world turned inside out. Their leader was gone, banished in disgrace. The rules were unknown. "All right," Taryn said, his voice breaking the silence. It was not loud, but it carried a new quality, clarity, and an open calm. The tense, forensic tone he'd used with Margaret was gone. I know that was incredibly difficult to watch, and I know you're all wondering what happens next. He walked a few steps toward the center of the room, putting himself among them, not above them. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and slipped his hands into his trouser pockets, a gesture that was more approachable, less like a formal address. "My name is Taryn Williams," he began. "As of last Wednesday, this is my dealership. I didn't plan for my first introduction to be this." He gave a small, acknowledging shake of his head. But perhaps it needed to be, because now there is no illusion about where we start from or what we will not tolerate. He made eye contact one by one with the employees who dared to look up. What you saw was the end of one way of operating, a way where fear, assumption, and disrespect were management tools. That ends now. He paused, letting the promise solidify. This is a place of business, yes. Our job is to sell cars. But we will sell them with integrity. We will greet every person who walks through those doors with the same baseline of respect, whether they're in a three-piece suit or covered in work dust, whether they're here to buy today or just to dream a little. A young woman from the finance department who had been nervously twisting a pen slowly put it down. Taryn continued, "My door will be open. Not just the physical one, but I am telling you now. If you see something that doesn't align with the values of respect and fairness we are building, you will have a voice. You will not be punished for using it. This," he said, gesturing around, "is not just my dealership. It's ours. Its reputation, its success, its soul, that will be a reflection of all of us together." He saw shoulders begin to relax. The fear was being slowly displaced by a dawning sense of possibility. It was fragile, but it was there. "Now," he said, his tone lightening just a fraction, becoming more pragmatic. "For the rest of today, I want you to do your jobs, serve the customers who are here, answer the phones, but do it with your heads held a little higher. Know that the person signing your checks believes your dignity at work is as important as the bottom line." He clapped his hands together once softly. "Let's get back to it." The spell broke. The employees stirred, glancing at each other, then moving with a new, tentative purpose. A salesman cleared his throat and approached the elderly couple who were still standing by the sedan, looking awestruck. "Mr. and Mrs. Evans, so sorry for that interruption. Shall we continue with those safety features?" As the low hum of business cautiously restarted, Taryn began a slow walk around the perimeter of the showroom. He wasn't inspecting cars now, he was observing the revival. He stopped by the reception desk. The young receptionist looked up, her eyes wide. "Are you all right?" Taryn asked her, his voice gentle. She nodded, swallowing. "Yes, sir, it was just intense." "It was," he agreed, "and it shouldn't have happened, but your composure was noted, thank you." He gave her a small, genuine smile before moving on. He was nearly to his office door when a voice called out, "Excuse me, young man." It was the elderly husband from the couple, Mr. Evans. He had detached from his wife and the salesman and was walking toward Taryn, his wife a few steps behind, her face soft with emotion. Taryn turned and extended his hand. "Sir, I deeply apologize for the scene today. That's not the experience you should ever have at one of my stores." Mr. Evans took his hand, his grip firm. "Son, an apology isn't necessary from you. What we saw," he shook his head, his eyes wise and sad. "We saw a wrong being righted. It took courage, real courage. Not a lot of that in the world anymore. My father would have been proud to see it." His wife nodded beside him, her eyes glistening. The unexpected affirmation hit Taryn with a quiet force. It wasn't about vindication, it was about connection, about the silent witnesses who understood the stakes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "That means more than you know." After seeing the couple off, Taryn finally stepped into the empty manager's office, his office now. He didn't sit in the high-backed leather chair. He stood at the window, looking out at his lot, bathed now in the deep orange light of sunset. The confrontation had been ugly, draining, and public, but it had burned away the rot cleanly and all at once. There was no lingering poison, no whispered dissent. The line had been drawn in fire, and everyone had seen which side of it they needed to be on. He hadn't just changed management, he had performed a cultural exorcism. The path ahead would be work, hiring a new manager who embodied the right principles, retraining, rebuilding trust. But the foundation, for the first time, was solid. It was built on the hard, unassailable ground of integrity. Outside, the lights on the lot began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating the rows of cars like promises. Taryn watched them ignite. It was no longer just a dealership. It was a fresh start. A place where respect was the first offer, and dignity was never up for negotiation. He turned from the window, ready to begin.